Look up the word crazy in the dictionary and you might just find an asterisk beside the definition that says, listen to the Subiquitous podcast featuring Sue Duffield and you'll find out what crazy means. Sue's travelogue journey of unfiltered stories, impossible miracles, and faith-filled fun will be revisited right here. So buckle up and let's get going with this humorous travelogue of an unfiltered saint, Subiquitous.
I always say that I think God puts in your path people that need to be with you at the right time for the right reason. Ellie has no idea my background. She has no idea my history, but she's going to know probably throughout this episode how important children are to me, and especially the disenfranchised children of the world. Elli Oswald is Executive Director of Faith to Action Initiative, but before that role, she served as Director of Mission and Outreach at Bethany Community Church in Seattle, and she guided Bethany Community Church in all kinds of ministries to the poor, vulnerable in Seattle and also around the world, and she served as the Children in Crisis Research and Communications Coordinator for World Vision International Child Development and Rights Technical Team. Boy, that's a long thing. But specializing, I love it, in community-based care for children deprived of parental care. We're going to talk about that in a few minutes. But her credentials are big, a BA from Pepperdine, an MA from Fuller. Ellie has also worked with a wide variety of nonprofit organizations, including Union Station Homeless Services in Los Angeles. Elli Oswald, what a joy to have you on the podcast today.
Well, it's great to be here. I'm excited to chat.
You always can gather within the first 30 to 60 seconds how you're going to approach someone. And immediately when your face popped up on the screen and we started to converse, I knew that this was going to be a good one. Ellie, what was in your childhood that prepared you to be an executive director of such a huge initiative like this called Faith to Action? How did that happen?
I have to point to my parents. I have incredible parents. I just recently moved to be closer to them, and I'm so enjoying that. First off, a mom who will defend me no matter what. Even if I'm in the wrong, she turns on her mama bear, and she's like, there's no way anybody's going to go after my daughter. And then I have a dad who's always been really good at identifying the unique gifts of individuals and sharing that. And I don't think that's that common in men of that generation, but he would say, like, you think differently, Ellie, and that's good. You know, sometimes you do feel different. I felt different than my peers as a kid. I felt like maybe I had different values or a bigger vision than maybe they did for life. But he always emphasized that that was good. That has really developed a confidence that has allowed me to step into spaces that maybe I was younger for, or maybe that I was less qualified for, and say, I have something to offer. I don't know if it's of value, and you guys can decide that, but I do have something, and doing that with prayer and knowing that God does give us all unique gifts and puts us in a space and a time to contribute to his good work. So I just have to give all the credit to my parents. And I joke with my team. Sometimes, I struggle with maybe they may be a little bit too confident.
No, it sounds to me like your parents built a pretty special gal. So even more so then, when you're dealing with children's issues around the world, especially orphans, I can see how your heart has been molded to those who did not have the privilege that you had of two great parents raising you with confidence. How has that approach helped you with teamwork and giving your colleagues a chance to say, listen, the world that we know may not exist in the world that we're going to minister to? How does that work?
You are exactly right in that it has motivated me. I remember just as a young person being exposed to a lot of different things, but it was a moment of supporting a school in the Bronx that they had 5 different principals in the first 3 months of school. I was in a ESL classroom that was not speaking any English. The kids were really struggling. The teachers were really struggling. And I just thought, how is this happening? How did I get the education I had and these kids get this education? And really rooted this desire to see justice and to be a part of God's reconciling work to see healing and wholeness in the lives of vulnerable children who perhaps don't have the kind of stability that I had in my family and in my community. And that has really sustained my work. I had my own children eventually, and, those moments in the middle of the night that they're crying out to you, my heart just kind of would leap, and I jump up to go pick them up. And it brings me to tears even today to imagine there's so many children who don't have someone that's doing that, and how instinctual and that drive internally for a mother to care for their child when a child doesn't have that, and they're left to cry. Or eventually we see in orphanages, children stop crying because no one comes.
Right.
And that is something that continues to drive me every day in this work.
That was a key phrase that you just said, because many missions trips that I've been on, the leader would tell us it might take 2 to 3 days, and maybe you're only there for 7, but it might take 2 to 3 days to be able to warm up to the orphans that are there, because they have built such a wall, and it is not their fault, because that's their only coping mechanism that they have, is to toughen up and to not let their emotions show. The difference between just going on a missions trip versus really sourcing families to help in the scenario. What's the difference in what your organization does versus some other organizations that just go on trips and then they come home?
Faith to Action, I didn't found Faith to Action, but I get to be a part of it, which is just God's handiwork of bringing us together. But Faith to Action's goal is actually to make family care the globally recognized best practice for meeting the needs of orphaned and vulnerable children around the world, as opposed to what we'd call residential care. So that would be your orphanages and children's homes. We believe that children belong in families, and that it is safe, loving family that's most essential for children's sense of belonging, for their emotional support, for their physical and mental development. Faith to Action ourselves, we don't run any programs actually, and we don't even provide any funding, because we are a coalition of organizations that do that work.
That's great.
But we all come together because we're focused on educating and mobilizing individual Christians like yourself and churches and faith-based organizations so they can do their best to support orphaned and vulnerable children. We know that there are at minimum 5 million children in orphanages around the world today.
Right.
And we also know that 80% of them have at least one living parent. So that's something that is often surprising. You would assume children in these facilities don't have parents. And many of these parents could care for their children if they were given support to do so. And that children who don't have parents often almost always have extended family members who could, or they could transition towards family through foster care or adoption or other means like that. And that's why it's important for us to think about our role in supporting orphaned and vulnerable children in responding to that biblical mandate to care for the orphan. One of the things we recognize is that residential care is actually having some negative outcomes on children, some unintended outcomes that we would never want to see.
And orphanages are not always the answer. And I love what you said there. I never even knew the statistic that about 80% of children that are in orphanages have some sort of family member still living or still present within the area. That just blows my mind.
When you kind of start to realize that children aren't in orphanages because they're orphans necessarily, you need to think through some of the complexity of why children end up in children's homes and orphanages. And the underlying reason, the most common by far underlying reason, is that child's family is poor. They're experiencing extreme poverty. So often a poor family has some sort of crisis that happens in their family, whether that's the loss of a job, an illness, or disability, something that happens where that vulnerable family feels like they're unable to provide for their child, or they're unable to protect their child and care for that child. You can imagine being maybe a single mom, a poor mom, and you're struggling just to get food for breakfast and dinner on the table, let alone, getting all your kids off to school. And imagine down the street, someone's building this shiny, beautiful building, and you hear that they're going to be providing free food for every child, a great education, and other supportive services. You kind of put vulnerable families in a hard situation where they have to make this impossible choice. They want all those things for their child, but they're really struggling to be able to do that.
Yeah.
And that's not a situation situation that we want to see happening. The reality is it is happening, but we want to be able to see resources come to families first so that they can care well for their children.
Right.
But the reality is most children don't end up in orphanages because they don't have family members who love them. They end up in those situations because their families are struggling to care well for them.
Right. You're amazing because you have already opened my eyes. I stated to you offline before we even started the interview that I have been a part of many organizations and also been on many missions trips to disenfranchised children around the world. The thing that just never occurred to me was the orphanage surely does look good to a mom who has 16 children and has no resource. And she realizes that if she puts her children in an orphanage, they do get education and they do get maybe 1 to 2 square meals a day.
Mm-hmm.
How can we fight that concept, though, if we're knowing that the family is really the most important part of a child's life, but yet that's what the mother sees and exactly what you said? How do we draw attention to that scenario?
I think what we need to recognize is that the context of family care is a natural response to most communities around the world. To be perfectly blunt, the idea of group care came through missionaries, often through the colonial kind of processes that led to more missionaries who were responding to needs,
Right.
really desiring to make a positive impact.
Sure.
But the family-based care is an indigenous idea in almost every community that we see orphanages.
Right.
It's a natural idea. Kinship care is a term that we use to talk about relatives or really close friends caring for children of a family member or of a close friend. And it's the most commonly used form of what we'd say alternative care, but it is also the least resourced. So we see families really struggling. Naturally, they know they should take in their sister's daughter or whatever, but they're struggling to be able to do that. And so in some ways, there's an injustice that's happened where we've tilted the scales towards separating children from families. And now is an opportunity for us to kind of rebalance things. When I'm talking from a U.S. Christian's perspective, often that's who we're working with is U.S. Christians who have incredible levels of generosity to children. We actually worked with the Barna Group to study U.S. Christians' perceptions of and support of global residential care, global orphanages and children's homes. We were shocked when it was a survey of 3,000 people, but it was created in a way that it could be projected out for the whole U.S. Christian population. And when they did that, we found 2.5 billion with a B dollars goes every single year from individual U.S. Christians to orphanages and children's homes. Mm. So we have heavily tilted that scale.
Yes, we have.
There's a lot of resources. I actually had to Google, I YouTubed, what is a billion?
I know, I can't fathom it.
It's a huge amount of money. It was like they were showing rice. This video was showing rice. This is a million and this is a billion. And I was just like, wow, it's a lot of money. So we have emphasized orphanages and children's homes for a lot of reasons. It's tangible. It makes sense to us. We can access those children. We can control those contexts and make sure they're safe and they're cared for. And we minimized strengthening their vulnerable families.
Right.
And it's really, when it comes to what children actually need, it's switched. We need to emphasize strengthening their families. And for some children, they need short-term, high-quality residential care, but it needs to be rehabilitative, quickly moving children back into families. And we need to support alternatives like foster care and domestic adoption in those countries. But coming from the perspective of U.S. Christians, we really have shifted that imbalance. And it's going to take us some work, but some real intentionality to shift back.
And have you seen some of that change in front of you?
Yes, there is good news.
Yeah.
So I've been in this space not that long, but 14, 15 years in what we call care reform. And there is a huge global shift happening. We are changing the way that we care for children around the world. And it's really an achievable goal, because it doesn't take long for us to figure this out. It makes sense. Research has tons of data showing the positive impact of a family setting, even poor families, and the challenging impacts and the negative impacts of residential. So research makes it clear. Bible, scripture recognizes God created family in Genesis as the system of community for our world. And we see in places like Psalms where God sets the lonely in families. So it makes so much sense, even just in our own instincts. You've talked about being on mission trips and seeing a vulnerable child. We have this internal drive to care for them, right? Like we know they need individualized, loving, long-term care. And many of us who have, loving families also know that, like I shared about myself. So this change is happening around the world. We're seeing a growing number of organizations that are working alongside their national governments to advocate for family care policies, implementing foster care and adoptions, and helping orphanages transition from a residential style care to a family-based care model. So reintegrating children back into families and then supporting that family well so that they can care well for that child, and monitoring, ensuring that that child is safe. It's been interesting at the international level. We've got some pretty extreme changes happening. Just in 2009, the United Nations, all of the governments that are a part of the United Nations, which is every government in the world except for two, agreed to two commitments. One is to end the institutionalization of children in their countries.
Wow.
So especially the very large style institutionals where you're seeing 100 kids cared for in one complex, or 500 or more in some places. So all of the countries in the world has essentially committed to ending that through the United Nations resolution, and also to prioritizing the building of family-based care options for children. So governments are starting to put pressure on faith-based organizations who are trying to do this work. And we're seeing a lot of faith-based organizations step up and say, you know what, I'm willing to be part of the solution. I'm willing to join this change. I'll be honest too, we see some organizations say, nope, this is what we've always done. This is what we've sold to our donors. This is what we're going to do forever. And that's a bummer. But overall, the needle is moving. I could share multiple organizations, hundreds of organizations that are doing really good work.
I won't give the name away, but there is one organization that I contribute to and am a part of and have been an ambassador for almost 9 years. They are under this umbrella of change right now, and I love it. And I said, you know what? I got an email it was probably midsummer from the CEO of the organization, and putting out all of those that are an artist who are on the road and obviously have all kinds of information about child sponsorship. I'll just put it that way. But I did read in the email that there are millions of children in orphanages around the world, is what they said, but this could all change. And I know that came from Faith to Action, because I thought, where else would they get that information from other than that incredible umbrella of an alliance between these organizations that had an old model. And so now they're thinking, wow, we need to adjust. And I'm praising God for that, because you are part of that adjustment and giving churches an opportunity also to rethink this whole thing.
Yeah. And I don't know if you have a reason for not saying it, but I think I know who it is.
Go ahead.
I would say I'm super excited to give people organizations who they can fund that are part of this work. And
go ahead. Do it. It's, you know what? There is no filter on this podcast. You know that. Go for it.
Child Fund is actually doing some incredible work.
That's who I'm a part of. That's correct.
To change the way that they're caring for children. And there are organizations in almost every country around the world. There's a group called Forgotten Voices in Eastern and Southern Africa.
Right.
And what they do is they really empower the local church to find vulnerable families and to wrap around them before they end up in a situation where their children need to be placed or are separated. There's a group called A Family for Every Orphan that's in Ukraine and in areas around Ukraine that is building up foster families and strengthening vulnerable families who've been reunified with their children. There's a group called Casa Viva in Central America that is doing the same type of work. There's so many. And you can check if your listeners are like, how can I find organizations that are close to me that are doing this, or they want to fund those organizations? We try to post stories of organizations that we've vetted that are doing quality family-based care in our stories. So we're always happy to if someone says, who do you know in Zambia, to try to make connections as well.
Oh my. And I want my listeners to know that Ellie and I did not have this conversation prior to our talk today I never told her that I was a Child Fund ambassador on the road when I do my speaking events. She had no clue, but I was very much aware that there was a shaking happening late spring, early summer, when I kept getting these emails on, we are rethinking the process. And I thought, this is so good. This is really where my heart is. And then to get a notification that you might be willing to be on this podcast today was just beyond me, not making the two go together. But today it's just blowing my mind how both of that works together.
Yeah, it is a really exciting time. And 14 years ago, it was a struggle to say this, to have anybody be receptive.
Yeah.
And now we see, World Vision is also one of our key partners, and they're doing incredible work to strengthen families. World Relief, many organizations.
Great.
People like us don't always know what's going on in these kind of international research and learning and best practices. And that's what Faith to Action is trying to do, is to help connect people who have a heart to serve with best practices. And this truly is a global shift. But one of the things that people often think is, well, like, there's this mandate to serve the orphan, and I don't want to serve the families, I want to serve the orphan. But something really interesting, a little tidbit to kind of tuck into your mind, is that scholars who've looked at this kind of mandate to serve the orphan recognize that the orphan and the widow are almost always together in Scripture.
That's true.
Not always, but almost always together. And some of them believe that they're actually a unit, that the people that would be hearing this for the first time would assume those two were going together, and it'd be more like an interpretation of the word fatherless, because being without the husband or the father in the family was an extremely vulnerable situation in those times. But often, like our churches, right, we have a widow's ministry and then we have an orphan ministry, and they're totally separate.
Yeah.
But in reality, potentially this was about serving single moms. And that changes things when we think about that mandate. There's potentially, we need to broaden our idea of what orphan care really is. Yeah. It can be so many things.
That's great. I think of the story of Dorcas or Tabitha, where Peter is summoned, come over here, she's dead. And the one phrase that goes around in my mind right now when I think about it said, and all of the orphans and all of the women were gathered around to see what Peter was going to do. Well, there's another scenario right there of community. And when you're basing just child sponsorship and just worried about one child, the truth is, actually, if I'd go back and look into the original information when they were looking for ambassadors like myself with Child Fund, if I recall, they are really concerned about the family. And I think this is what the model fit in really well with Faith to Action and what your initiative is. How can people that are listening right now, what is their best contact for you and for the organization to get more information from?
We're just here to educate and help you connect with things that can help you move forward in supporting orphaned and vulnerable children around the world. I love that, because I'm not trying to sell anybody anything.
I love it too.
All of our resources are free for download. We'll even deliver if you want something printed. We'll send it to you. But you can check out our website, faith2action.org. There's other faith and actions, but it's Faith to Action.
To Action, correct. Yeah.
But yeah, I just want to encourage people. I think it's not a hard sell. We know that children need families. And what I would just say is that it actually is possible to see children and families. These ideas of the orphan crisis are really overwhelming, but we are seeing things move forward. And I don't think people realize how much they can have an impact in that space. U.S. Christians, but Christians all over the world have been caring for children since the early days of the church. Right. There's historical documents that show that children who were cast out of Rome because Roman families didn't want them, or they had a disability or something, or it was a shameful situation, it was the early church that actually took those children into their families and raised them as their own.
Right.
And Christians have been serving sacrificially ever since then to serve these children. And yeah, maybe you send $30 a month or whatever it is, your contribution adds up. That $2.5 billion, the vast majority of that was given as small regular contributions. So probably child sponsorship. So it's just $30. I'm not really making impact, but that all adds up. And we are in a position to really make an impact in changing the tide and moving things forward. A couple of things to just think about is your funding, right? Be an educated donor. Learn about what your organization is doing. Just because they do sponsorship doesn't mean they're serving in orphanages. Like right. A lot of them are doing family strengthening through sponsorship, but ask those questions, dig a little bit deeper, and understand. And if there's opportunity to open a conversation, encourage you to take that. The other really exciting thing you can do is spread the word. So many of us have this idea of there are orphans and that's a problem and the solution is the orphanage. Well, hopefully after listening today, we realize that isn't the solution. That should be a very last resort. And for very few children, the vast majority can find family or can stay in their family. So spread the word about that. You know, great. We're coming up on the holidays. You're sitting next to Aunt Myrtle and say, do you know what I heard on this podcast?
You wouldn't want to sit next to my Aunt Myrtle. I do have an Aunt Myrtle, so you don't want to. Of course, she's in heaven now. So
no way you have the Aunt Myrtle. That's hilarious. Oh, that's funny. That name came out of the sky for me.
See, you know me but without knowing me. I'm telling you.
Spread the word. That's one thing. If you follow us on social media, you can start to share things that open people's mind. Because if we know better, Christians, we do better. And so just encourage you to do that. Talk to your church. What are you guys doing in this space? You know, this is something I'm learning. Here's some resources. Let's talk about this together. You don't want to push anybody, but I think we can have those conversations and pray. Yeah. Pray for this movement. Pray, it's a time where Christians could really shine in the broader spaces. It's a time of witness to the world. I always talk about the train has left the station when it comes to care reform. This change is happening. We have the international mandates, national mandates. We have organizations that are stepping up and saying, yes, I'll be a part of this change. But the train has left the station. And my question is where will Christians be on this? We could be the caboose of that train, screeching the brakes, right? With sparks flying saying no, I'm not going to change. Or what I want to see is we could be the headlight of that train because we actually have the vision in scripture of family and we care for families every day in our churches. Yeah, and that is such an incredible witness to the world to say we are going to be leading in this family strengthening effort. We're going to be leading in finding family solutions for children. And I'm excited to see that happen.
I love it. And there is obviously a better way. There's no doubt about it. And in this growing movement, I love to see how the safety of children is such a priority, number one. And number two, how families, although broken down in our Western culture, we don't even know what defines a family anymore. But let's just say this. We have a job to do and we have a continual calling. I think you have, Ellie, you have a calling on your life, not just a role. It's a calling on your life to see change. And I love it because it starts with the family and it shifts with strengthening the family and increasing all of these alternate care options. And I love the fact that on Instagram, when I follow Faith to Action, by the way, I encourage our listeners to do that. One of the memes they have on there says, there are millions of children in orphanages around the world, but this all could change. And Faith to Action is part of that change. In fact, I'm so happy to hear this. What a great, great opportunity and ministry to the world. Ellie, listen, you have obviously become a fast friend of mine already, and I hope it's not the last time that we talk. I have a feeling it's just the beginning. Is there anything that we can do on our part to get the word out about Faith to Action?
There's a cool resource that a bunch of Christian organizations came together to create. It's called the Global Church Pledge. If you Google Global Church Pledge, it should come up, but it's not just for churches, it's for individuals. Okay. It's globalchurchpledge.org. And it's essentially, you'll read it, it's 2 sentences. And it's essentially saying, I'm going to do whatever I can do to see children in safe and loving families. So go on and sign it and then share it on your social media. That's an easy thing to do today. Yeah. And it also will plug you into some of the organizations that you can continue to learn more. And would happy to connect with anybody listening. Just reach out to info@Faith to Action or social media or whatever. And we would love to connect.
That's great. Well, Ellie's parents, wherever you are, if you're listening, you did a good job and you need to know that.
They will love that.
I know. They need to know that they saw something in you. And I especially communicate with you that my father, probably even older than your dad, always instilled in me, even though I was the first female grandchild on both sides, right? that there wasn't anything that I couldn't do. I could play sports like the guys. I could do whatever it took. My dad always said to me, you know what? You can do anything you put your heart and mind into. And Ellie, I have a feeling your dad is saying that now, wherever he is, that he's proud of you. And I'm proud of you, and I'm excited that we're all going to kind of be in this alliance together. So be sure, listeners, to get on theglobalchurchpledge.org, post it on all your social media, and also get on faithtooaction.org. And let's spread the word, and let's be part of the change that's happening in the culture of families around the world. Thank you, Ellie, for being on the Subiquitous podcast today.
Thank you so much, Sue.